Hey guys, we're going to start our mini lectures on the autonomic nervous system. And in order to do that, we got to review a little bit about the divisions of the nervous system. Recall that you have a central nervous system and then you have a peripheral nervous system. Central is brain and spinal cord, peripheral is everything outside of that. In other words, all your nerves. Now, the peripheral nervous system has sensory nerves and motor nerves. For the motor part of that, there's a somatic portion, which controls skeletal muscle, and then an autonomic part that controls smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And what we're going to do today, and for a while, is to go over the autonomic nervous system to examine the two parts of it, which are the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So let's keep on doing that. There are some nicknames that are handy to have. The sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic response, is often referred to as your fight or flight response because it'll cause changes in your body that you are aware of and familiar with if you're scared or if you're nervous. So think about your eyes going wide, think about your heart beating fast, your airways in your lungs opening up, sweat forming, mouth getting dry. Those are all sympathetic things. Now, parasympathetic is nicknamed the rest and digest branch because it's going to have a lot to do with digestion, hence the word digest there. Plus, it's going to have things like blood pressure going down, heart rate going down. So these are good nicknames, and we're actually going to come back to these quite a bit. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but let's just review for a second. The somatic nervous system is going to control skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system is going to control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And what we actually see here is we see some cardiac muscle right there. Some nice cardiac muscle in that beautiful human heart right there. All cardiac muscle, all under the control of the ANS. So cardiac muscle is an ANS effector. Smooth muscle too. This organ on the right here, this is a stomach. All these folds, by the way, are folds that can unfold as your stomach fills up with food. And if we look at the wall of the stomach right here, this pinkish layer right here, this is all smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, plus glands. Those are the effectors of our autonomic nervous system. So, speaking of glands, we do see some glands right here. As a matter of fact, here is a very nice salivary gland, the parotid gland. We can see a submandibular salivary gland there as well. So, three basic effectors for the autonomic nervous system: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Now, if we contrast that with the somatic nervous system, it is going to have skeletal muscle as its effectors. So we see a bunch of skeletal muscles. You probably know a lot of these guys from the muscle labs. But skeletal muscle is your somatic effector. Now, this is a good time to point out, remember, skeletal muscle is considered voluntary. Those other effectors, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, are all considered involuntary. So that's a good little fact to know as well. All right, if we actually look at the nerves, the neurons, we have a skeletal muscle right here. This is a skeletal muscle. My pointer is on. From the spinal cord, to get to that skeletal muscle, it's going to be a single somatic neuron. It's going to start in the ventral horn of the cord, comes out in the ventral root, spinal nerve, goes to the skeletal muscle. It is quite myelinated all the way along. Lots of Schwann cells here, big Schwann cells. At the synapse, the neuromuscular junction here, acetylcholine is going to be the neurotransmitter released. If we compare that somatic pathway with the autonomic pathway? Well, we're not starting in the ventral horn, we're starting in the lateral horn. And we actually have two neurons to get to our effector, which in this case is cardiac muscle. And in this 2-neuron pathway, our first neuron starts in the lateral horn, goes out in the ventral root, spinal nerve, gets to a ganglion somewhere along the way. We'll see there are different places this ganglion could be. And at that ganglion, our first neuron releases acetylcholine. By the way, in case you're wondering, acetylcholine is spelled just like it sounds. Acetylcholine. Yeah. And acetylcholine is released at the first junction here. Then our second neuron travels to our effector, and depending on whether it's a sympathetic or parasympathetic neuron, it's going to determine what neurotransmitter it releases here. If this is a parasympathetic pathway, then acetylcholine is released onto the effector organ. If it's a sympathetic pathway, then norepinephrine. Let's write that out too. Again, just exactly like it sounds. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter. Now notice that our single somatic neuron is entirely myelinated. In our autonomic pathway, first neuron is myelinated. It's actually just kind of lightly myelinated. And the second neuron is unmyelinated. So the somatic pathway is definitely much faster. Because first of all, it's only one neuron. You don't have to have any of this. These events are going to take longer than just having an action potential shoot through. But there's only one neuron, and it's heavily myelinated. Here we have two neurons. That's slower. The first one is lightly myelinated, and the second one is unmyelinated. Here's the thing. Somatic skeletal muscle control has to be super fast. Think about, when you're walking, you got to have like instantaneous adjustments. You can't be slow. All right, what else? I think that's it for this page. Now, let's get rid of my drawings here so I can advance the slide. Okay, here we have another picture, kind of comparing and contrasting this same idea. For the somatic nervous system, starting up here at the top, we have a single motor neuron leaving the CNS and going to our effector, which is skeletal muscle. That single neuron is heavily, I almost said heavenly myelinated, heavily myelinated, so big Schwann cells all the way down, and it releases acetylcholine. And by the way, the effect of the somatic stimulation here is always stimulatory. The only thing that can happen is the muscle can contract in response to the signal. All right, if we look at the sympathetic pathway, and we'll just look at this top part here, you can kind of ignore this down here for now. So sympathetic pathway, green here, okay, where my pointer is, cell body of the first motor neuron in the CNS. Then we go, axon lightly myelinated to a ganglion somewhere along the way. Again, we'll see where later. And that at that ganglion, our first neuron releases acetylcholine. Then our second neuron is unmyelinated. It heads out to our effector, and it releases norepinephrine. Now, the parasympathetic pathway is definitely similar. We'll see a few differences later on. First neuron, lightly myelinated, goes to a ganglion, releases acetylcholine. Second neuron leaves a ganglion, goes to the effector, releases acetylcholine again. So parasympathetic is acetylcholine both times. Sympathetic is acetylcholine the first time, and norepinephrine onto the effector. Now, of course, the effector can be smooth muscle, like we'd have in these intestines here, cardiac muscle, like we'd have in the heart, and glands. Now, another final important thing to note is that the effect of these two neurotransmitters can be either stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on what neurotransmitter and what organ. So that's it for mini lecture number 1.